We spend a large portion of our lives at work, and our society is full of conflicting messages about what we should expect in terms of our happiness at work, such as, do you want to love the work that you do and you'll never work a day in your life, versus work isn't supposed to be fun, that's why it's called work. To help us understand what drives happiness at work and then create careers that include more of that, I invited Yale professor Dr. Jessica Wilen to the show. Hi, Dr. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, let's start with your career path and actually how it led you to focus on helping organizations be more, quote, human.
Sure. So I've always been interested in human growth and development. After finishing my master's in social work, I started my career as a psychotherapist, actually specializing in working with both survivors and perpetrators of sexual violence. And when I went back for my PhD, I had the opportunity to work closely with the dean of the school. And that was really kind of a career defining experience for me, because though I had always been interested in organizational behavior and leadership development, that was her area of scholarship. So I really had the opportunity to dive deep and explore the literature, do some research myself, do some organizational consulting on the side. And I really loved that work. And when I graduated, I realized that I was more interested in applied leadership as opposed to the research side of things. And so I started my kind of postdoctoral career doing higher education administration. So had a few different roles, served as the assistant dean of students at Washington University in St. Louis, and then ended up at Yale, both as a professor in the Child Study Center, but then also worked for a while as the director of professional standards, doing in-house organizational consulting and leadership coaching in the medical school. So I think, the thread that really weaves through this whole experience is my perspective. And so, like I said, I started, I'm a social worker, and what makes social work different as opposed to other fields is an understanding of individuals within the context of their greater environment, right? And so when I talk about organizations being more human-centered, I really mean two things by this. And one of them is that it's impossible to understand employees without understanding their larger social ecology, right? So what's going on outside of our work lives matters. So, is somebody a single mom? Are they struggling with infertility? Are they taking care of aging parents? All of these circumstances are going to impact how we show up at work, right? And that seems really obvious, but the way we structure our organizations, it's not always apparent that they really understand that. And for me, the second part of that, it's not just that employees have lives outside of work, it's that these experiences make them better and more dynamic employees. And I think that second part really hit home for me when I became a mom. That led to a big shift in my identity. And I can think through several examples of how that was true for me. And so, that's part of the focus of my work is working moms, but it's not just working moms. Like I said, I think the thread that weaves through is understanding that, organizations need to become more human-centered to attract and retain their top talent.
Absolutely. I mean, there's that saying, you bring your human to work, right? That saying for a reason. I think the long gone are the days of work is work and life is life, and you keep those two worlds separate. Just like many of us probably bring our work home with us. I think the idea of being happy at work means different things today to people than it used to. I think it probably, in a long time ago, when there was more of a definition or a defined separation between the two, maybe it meant money, right? Like your salary. But today it truly, I think, means if I'm going to spend this many working hours away from these other things in my life, I need to have some sort of happiness. And I think the problem with that question is it always leads people to ask the bigger question of well, what are the things that define happiness? And I remember we had a positive psychologist on the show once, and she said the struggle with the word happiness is that it's this emotion that you can experience 20 times a day versus a constant state. And so we have this thing that we're striving for, which is happiness at work, but we're sort of maybe not thinking about it the correct way. And I know this is something that you talk about. You also have a newsletter, because I'm sure you didn't have enough things going on. You started a newsletter. It's actually fantastic. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's called A Cup of Ambition. And you mentioned that one of the questions you're asked the most about is, how can I be happier at work? What do you say to these people?
Yeah. So, speaking from both personal experience and the literature, we are happiest when we are doing work that aligns with our values. Decades of business research finds that leaders who are attuned to their core values build more trusting relationships. And teams that share similar values report greater group cohesion and job satisfaction. And on the flip side of that, when there's some sort of discrepancy in values, that can be one of the most demoralizing and really hardest to solve causes of burnout. So, one of the things I recommend to people, and I have all of my coaching clients do this when we start, is complete a values inventory. So values are tricky, right? Like, we know we have them, but we very rarely intentionally reflect on what they are. And so I recommend sitting down, take 20 minutes and really write out like your 5 to 7 core values. What are those principles that really define who you are? And then write like a 1 or 2 sentence description of what that word means to you. And I would say that like 9 times out of 10, when someone's unhappy in their job, there's some sort of values misalignment.
What are some examples of values? I think my struggle, and I've asked people on the show this before, so I like putting you guys on the spot a little bit, because I'm a visual learner. And so one of the things I love is like, I like to see examples. So like, what are some examples of values that your clients come up with?
Yeah, sure. I always provide people with a list because I'm the same way. It's like, and
Yeah.
it's very abstract, right? So it's helpful to
Yes.
have some examples. So it really varies, for some people. I mean, for me personally, I have a value around connection, right? It's really important for me that I feel connected to other people in a way that's meaningful. I have a value around introspection. So it's important for me to really, be thoughtful and examine who I am and the choices I'm making in my life. But, I mean, values really can run the gamut: integrity, truth, balance. The possibilities are endless.
I love that. So you also had written about, you found kind of these 3 characteristics that drive work satisfaction, and they were purpose, autonomy, and relationships. I would love if you could explain each of those, because that also made a lot of sense to me when I was thinking about values. I was thinking about those 3 words also, and I was like, yes, those words that also drive satisfaction. I'm very much aligned with those. But can you explain what you meant by each of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can start with purpose. So, really since the beginning of like recorded history, people have searched for the greater meaning, right? It's very human to want to feel like what we're doing matters, and we spend a lot of time at work. So, for some people, this is very clear, and these are often people who talk about their work as being a calling. And so, if you think about people in healthcare, right? These are people that feel that there's inherent meaning in curing patients, or helping people get better. Or you hear teachers talk about the meaning that they feel guiding the next generation. But you don't have to be like curing cancer to find meaning in your work, right? I worked with a client who actually felt kind of disconnected from her organization's mission. She ran a section of a business in charge of retail sales, and she kind of questioned, what is the meaning of this work? But she found great purpose in her role as a manager, and took a lot of satisfaction in helping to mentor more junior employees. So there are different ways that we can create meaning. And there's actually a study from a colleague of mine at Yale in the School of Management, Amy Resnesky, and some of her colleagues, looking at hospital custodians. And so this is a group that I think most people would agree, like, this is not the most glamorous profession out there. But they interviewed these custodians, and what they found was that the custodians who were most satisfied in their work were those who tied into a larger mission. And so those who spoke about themselves as helping create the environment in which people can heal were more satisfied in their job. And there's one anecdote from the study that I just love, and it's of a custodian who would go into the rooms of patients who were comatose and move around the pictures in the room, thinking that maybe that would help, stimulate something or help with the healing, right? And so this was not part of this person's formal job description, but it was something that they did to make their work more meaningful to them. And so, I think that there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that. Moving on to the autonomy piece, I think this has become particularly important in our post-pandemic world.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And when I talk about autonomy, what I'm talking about is the degree of control that employees have over their ability to make decisions about their job. And one of the ways that this shows up a lot, especially now, is flexibility, right? Like survey after survey shows people want more flexibility. And there was one survey in particular that looked at like knowledge workers, and almost 60% of respondents said that flexibility was more important than salary or benefits, right? So this is like really resonating with people right now. People don't want to be micromanaged, right? That undermines their sense of competence if they feel like somebody's always looking over their shoulder, and if they don't have the ability to make decisions, whether, either because of a micromanaging boss or because of just kind of large bureaucratic
Like the
inefficiencies.
rules of the workplace too. Like you have to be
Yeah.
here 3 days a week, and
Yep.
those are the rules. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I think for most people, this need for autonomy is tied to a sense of competence, right? Like people want to feel trusted that they can make decisions about how they work in a way that works for them. So that's the second piece. And then the third piece, which really is not to be underestimated, is relationships. By the time we enter the working world, when we're in our early 20s, we spend significantly more time with our colleagues than we do with our non-work friends. And from ages 30 to 55, we spend approximately equal time with our colleagues as we do with our partner. So that's a lot
Wow.
of time, a lot of time we're spending with
Yes.
our colleagues, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it's no wonder that this is like a major driver of satisfaction at work. And some people might be familiar with the employee engagement survey that Gallup puts out. They asked several questions about workplace engagement. And one of the ones that they found that is maybe my favorite question that they ask is, do you have a best friend at work? And people who say that they have a best friend at work are more engaged. And this is particularly true for women, who are like, those who have a best friend at work are more than twice as likely to be engaged.
Yeah, I can attest to that. Like I think people aren't in love with this term anymore, but I'm going to use it because I feel like it represents my relationship. It's like a work wife. Like I absolutely
Yeah.
had a work wife, like a work best friend. The one I had before, we're still friends. She was a bridesmaid in my wedding, like truly like became one of my best friends. And I understand what you mean about, we absolutely do spend more time with these people, and you build, and also there's a relationship based off of that you build with the people you work with, that you like once you're out of school, it's not that you can't have that relationship with still your best friend, but they don't understand as much of the context, right? Like this person also understands when
Yeah.
you're talking about Joe in accounting, they're like, yeah, I know about Joe in accounting, that kind of thing. So I totally understand why it's a bonding activity. I also think that toxic workplaces and the real bad toxic relationships are one of the reasons why people are so unhappy in workplaces, and why. And I think we started to see more and more people talking about that and sharing about behavior that their bosses or coworkers were doing. Especially I felt like during COVID, that was becoming more of a thing to share on social media, where other people were like, no, that's not normal. And we actually just had someone leave a comment on our Instagram, and she said she's in her mid 40s and she's finally in a workplace where everybody treats everyone with respect. She really enjoys working there, and that she didn't know it could exist. And in your experience, you coach a lot of clients. Would you say that most workplaces, the relationships are pretty healthy, or that most places, yeah, they're toxic and people have to work their way out of there to find, good relationship workplaces?
I think it really depends. it's hard to kind of say kind of more broadly than that, other than it depends. I think, the people who are happiest in their role, as we've already talked about, are the people who feel connected and feel appreciated.
So maybe when you're interviewing or thinking about whatever you want to do next, you kind of start there and work your way backwards. Like, where are the places where people are going to have more of a purpose? Or maybe the company is really clear on what their values are and they're promoting that. And they're maybe probably being better about hiring for value fit versus just culture fit. And you can kind of work backwards from there. Because I think ultimately, I agree with everything you're saying. I think ultimately people say, well, how can I make sure that I find a workplace that has that? And then, the struggle is that not every workplace promotes their values or shares their values in the job description. And so you kind of have to do this working backwards exercise to really find. That's why I'm a huge advocate of, when you're job searching, search for companies first and then jobs second, because I think, to your point, finding those companies is where you'll find more engaged and happier employees, better relationships, and then everything kind of falls into place. I
You're
guess if you, oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I would just say you're so right. It's difficult often to know up front what you're getting into, because when you're interviewing, they're putting on a little bit of a glossy sheen, like you don't know exactly what you're getting. And one question that it actually comes from Adam Grant, who's a professor at Wharton, that he recommends people ask is, tell me a story about something that can only happen here. And so if you ask that question in an interview, it really can elicit some really important information. And I actually asked this question at a workshop that I did, and the answers were really interesting. One woman spoke about returning to work after her mother died and how she was just enveloped in this caring community. Colleagues had gotten together ahead of time to think about, kind of smaller projects they could take off her plate. Somebody brought her a plant, people brought her baked goods. It was this like very visceral experience for her of being taken care of. Somebody else talked about, a really toxic scenario she was in at her company. So that kind of question, I think, can get at, what's it really like here?
Mm-hmm. And what about for people who are in a workplace right now, and maybe they're at that pivotal moment where they're trying to decide, do I stay here? Do I go look for something else? Is there a way for you to decipher if you can make it work here, if it's maybe not so bad, if maybe you just need to do a little of your own homework versus like, this is a broken workplace and you have to get out?
Yeah. I think that I actually, it's fairly common that clients are coming to me with those kinds of questions, right? Like, can I make this work, or is it time to go? I think looking for any like values misalignments, because that's different than just like things that are annoying or irritating to you, right? Those values
Right.
misalignment are, like I said, a little bit harder to move past. So scanning for those, and really getting clear on what are your priorities right now in your career. I talk a lot about different seasons in your career, that the decision you make now isn't necessarily the decision you're making forever, which again seems obvious, but we tend to, when we're making big decisions, think about this as like this big decision that's going to have these huge ramifications forever, and that may or may not be the case, right?
Yeah.
So I think getting some clarity about like, what are your priorities right now at this stage, knowing that that may change in the future.
Yeah, the whole why are we here doesn't have to be why am I here at this workplace for the rest of my life, just maybe why am I here at this chapter or stage in my life. That actually brings up a good question I had. So you had mentioned that when you became a mom, it kind of became a huge shift in your career. I've actually experienced the same type of thing, and I'm sure I experienced it maybe right out of college too. Any big pivotal life moment where I felt like when I got out of college, it increased my ambition, right? Like I became extremely ambitious. I really wanted something. I really wanted to work hard. I kind of wanted to like give my life to a company. And now that I'm a mom and I have two under the age of two, it's so much work and it's a lot of mental gymnastics with all of that. And I feel like my ambition, maybe it's not that it has slowed down, but it's changed and maybe it's paused a little bit, or I don't know. I almost have this question sometimes where I'm like, what is happening to my ambition? I mean, this is obviously a topic that you talk about in your newsletter, which is called A Cup of Ambition. Like, how do you deal with these moments? Or like, what are we supposed to do in these moments?
Yeah, yeah. So I love that question. And people sometimes ask me what is up with the title of this newsletter? And so I always say it comes most directly from the Dolly Parton song 9 to 5. There's a line about pour myself a cup of ambition. So, it's meant to be kind of cheeky and fun. But it also was inspired by an offhanded comment that my boss made to me when I was pregnant. So before going out on leave with my first child, I had spent almost a year designing this new program at the university I worked. Did a lot of research into it, talked to a lot of both internal and external stakeholders, and, had this big proposal. And I was walking into my boss's office to find out if it was going to be green lighted or not. And it was, which was great. And, my hope was that I would be the one to lead it. And, she said to me, Jessica, this job is yours. If you want it, you're clearly qualified for it. But I want you to think about, once the baby comes, whether you really want it. And, and I looked at her like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, I wanted this so badly. And, she was like, you may find that you're less ambitious. And I was horrified,
Yeah,
right?
I was
I
gonna
mean,
say, please don't
like,
say that to people who are pregnant, especially first time moms, like, because
yeah,
you are hitting a trigger point with that, right?
totally. I mean, and
Yeah.
I know I do believe she had like well-meaning intentions and she was a mom herself, but like, what kind of sexist bullshit was that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, I like was irked by this and I couldn't quite shake it for a long time. And it's interesting because what I found once I became a mom, it's not that I became less ambitious. It's that my definition of success changed, right? So ambition really means like striving for success, right? Like being successful. And it's not that I wanted to be any less successful. It's just that what success meant was more expansive, right? Like
Yeah.
before becoming a mom, it was really tied to external markers
Yes.
of achievement,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
Like the
Totally.
next degree, the next promotion. And
Yeah.
all of that, it's not that it wasn't important, but it was less important. And I
Yeah.
cared about my career and having a meaningful career, of course, but I also cared about being like an involved mom.
Yeah.
And it just became more expansive. And I think things kind of clicked into perspective a little bit more. And
I
so
love
I
that.
think, yeah, I just, there are so many articles out there about like, I'm losing my ambition. What does ambition mean in a post-pandemic world? And I guess it's not about ambition. For me, it's more about it's a changing definition of success. And that changes. I mean, whether you become a parent or not, I think our definition of success evolves across the lifespan, and leaving some room and space to really define what that means to you in each kind of chapter of your life, I think is important.
Yeah. I think you've defined it perfectly, even for me too, because I think I've struggled with the word ambition a little bit, but to your point, it's actually, I'm just redefining my definition of success. And I agree, when I was younger, it was very much on external things. As I've gotten older, it's less on external things. And also, one thing I've noticed for me is I have to have a sense of control in my career. I think with kids and all the stuff that comes with them, you can lack some control there. And so for me, a career has actually been come almost like more important because it's this thing I'm choosing to spend my time with, and I know what I want to get out of it. Whereas before, and I think this is with all working parents, is your time becomes just so valuable and you're like wanting to be really
Yeah.
really proactive about where you spend it and how you spend it. And so it's been an interesting experiment, especially being focused on this work similar to you, where it's like until you're in it, you don't quite get that. But also, I feel better where I'm at today because my definition of success is less on these external factors that felt like a treadmill that was like constantly someone was just speeding it up. So there's pros and cons, and I think everyone goes through a different experiment or experience, I mean, and I'm sure as your kids go older, it's something different too. And so I think this is, it's kind of this like good warm up of maybe not being overly tied to something too. I think I've become a lot more flexible in, the way I think things can be done or should be done. Whereas when I was younger, it was like, get your job, do this, do this. You know, you
Yes.
felt like it was very linear, right?
Totally. And Lauren, you're so right. And that's what I'm talking about when I said earlier that these external to work experiences make us better at our job. I'm the same way. I also became much more flexible in my thinking and much more able to like roll with the punches
Yes. Yeah.
since becoming a mom, right? And like that's changed who I am, but that also helps me in the workplace, right?
Yes.
Like that ability to be more flexible and to be more patient and all of the other ways that I've changed have made me a better employee. And I think that we often hide that. We hide the way that parenthood changes us or other
Yeah.
experiences. It's not just parenthood, it's other life experiences. We hide that when not only should it be acknowledged, but I believe it should be celebrated.
Yeah, I would agree too. I think there's this huge thing out there where it's like working moms is a disadvantage where I'm like, no, it's the advantage. Like you you know,
Yep.
like I hope we can start that rumor and it becomes a thing because society is also on board with telling us that working parents work less, they're not as ambitious, you know, quote unquote ambitious to
Mhm.
your point.
Yep.
What it really means is a standard view on success for that example. But yeah, I think all this is, you know, the whole idea of like, why are we here and what builds happiness at work? I think it's important to determine your own values, try to align with a company that has those same values. And I guess my last and final question is, since that was such the key foundational part of this work is, how do you find out the values of a company if you don't, if they're not like advertising it? Is it questions you ask in the interview? Is it, you know, I know you gave the example of what Adam Grant described, but is there anything you can do externally before you get into that interview seat to kind of learn about a company's values?
Yeah. I think if it's a bigger company and you have some connections or distant connections there, trying to find out from people who currently work there or, recently worked there and no longer do. I think really cluing into some of the subtext during the interview process. And this is a time when I think I'm a huge proponent of remote work, but I think interviewing is one instance where it's really valuable if you can be there in person, to be there in person, to try to
Mm-hmm.
pick up on, some of the interpersonal cues as to what's
Yeah,
going
for
on and
sure.
get a sense of the culture, right? So, when you're being handed off from person to person, like what is their interaction like? If you are in a group interview, this was big in higher education. I know every field is different, but I loved this as a candidate because I would be there with 4 or 5 different people. And what I would be paying attention to is, do these people know each other? First of
Yeah.
all, do
Do
they
they cut
like
each
each
other
other?
off? Yeah. Do they
Yeah,
like each
right.
other?
Are they respectful? Is somebody dominating the conversation? Like I was always very attuned to some of those dynamics. I can recall interviewing at places where it was like an admin who would take me from place to place. And I always paid attention to how are people interacting with that admin? Are they just like ignoring them altogether, or is
Yeah.
there respect there? Because that said something to me. So I think, really cluing into some of those interpersonal interactions can give you a lot of information about the culture.
Yeah. I love that. So we can all be happier at work. If we're going to be spending this much time with all these people, which we
You got to
are,
like them,
yeah,
right?
you gotta like them, and you know, ideally work somewhere where you've got some sort of purpose. And I agree with you. When I was an admin, I think people always felt I was an admin at a dental school, and I think people always felt like all you do is answer the phones. It's like, no, think of all the anxious students that are applying for that dental school, and I'm the first
Yep.
face that they come and they see. Like I do remember, I didn't love that job, but I do remember thinking like, gosh, I am the first experience they have at this dental school, and they want to get in and they're so nervous, and like it's my job to help that, you know. And I think that, you know, it doesn't just have to be the medical field or education, which I know I just used a higher education example, but I think it's fine what your purpose is in the work that you're doing. I think that's key. So Jessica, can you tell people where they can find you, follow you, mention your newsletter again and everything?
You can find me at my newsletter, acupofambition.substack.com. My coaching website is jessicawilencoaching.com. You can schedule a complimentary consultation through my website. And then I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Dr. Jessica Wilen.
Amazing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.